All right, well, why don't we go ahead and get going? Like I said beforehand, I will record this. We'll send out a recap, and then for those that couldn't make it, obviously you guys are all here, so I'm not really talking to you. But for those that are watching this recording, I'll try my best to kind of let people in as they come. So maybe to set the stage a little bit, I'll give a quick introduction of kind of why we're having today's topic and conversation. I'll do a quick introduction of who I am, and then we'll kind of get into the meat and potatoes here of today's conversation. I think, my goal is to generally keep these in about 30 minutes or so. It's one thing that we host webinars multiple times per month. And over the last couple months, they've really kind of turned into more dynamic conversations. It's not very common that you can get 15, 20, upwards of 50, 60 scholarship providers in a room together and share best practices and insights and things that, you guys might be seeing. So it's a really good opportunity, within the chat system here in Zoom. If you've got questions or comments, if you want to contribute, by all means do that. We hosted a webinar last month where we had a topic in mind, probably 15 minutes in, questions came in, we actually completely shifted, and it turned into 25 minutes of me not even talking at all, and letting you guys kind of collaborate with one another to talk about best practices and trends that, were impacting you. So, again, my goal is to kind of create this community and this ecosystem where we can kind of help one another out. So, kind of leading into today's conversation, where I want to spend the bulk of my time is kind of on one of the last bullet points here, which is creating like a fair, unbiased, and compliant selection process. And I'll kind of get more into why we're going to talk more about that. But times have changed quite a bit as scholarship providers, and we've seen a lot of biases being put forth into review and selections. Maybe not the most fair candidates have been selected. How do you measure impact long term? And so we'll kind of talk more about that. I think if there's one takeaway from today that you guys can apply to your programs, it'll come in that section. But the reason why we're having this conversation today is there was a reoccurring conversation that popped up about 2 months ago. And they were organizations who we didn't work with, who kind of came to us with two kind of common problems. Problem number one was organizations that ran scholarships through very manual processes. So largely they're having applicants send them emails with a bunch of attachments, their transcripts, their references, you name it. And a couple of them said kind of really scary things. And it was as people applied, it would either A, go to their spam filter, because as of about 12 months ago, the way spam filters work with Gmail and Microsoft Office, or whatever their Outlook, is a large percent of messages go to spam nowadays. And they're actually having really deserving candidates who are applying for scholarship funding that went to a spam filter. And when they sat down as a team to go through the entire judging selection process, they even cut checks and awarded scholarships. They found out months later that there were deserving candidates that said, hey, what's the results? Did I receive a scholarship? And they're left thinking like, no, we didn't even review your application. And that was why they found it later on in their spam filter. So obviously as a nonprofit or as a foundation, as a volunteer, like we do these programs because we care. And so it's obviously terrible to see those types of things happen. But number two is now we're opening our doors to a lot of risk and potential compliance concerns. The other thing we started to see was organizations that try to create systems and create efficiencies, which we'll get into here in just a minute. And they try to spin up, a bunch of tools to run their scholarships. So built-in web forms, emails, downloading of documents, lots and lots of spreadsheets. And they had very similar results. So what ended up happening is as they were downloading and exporting and recompiling these scholarship applications, they would send off to the review team and potentially things would get misplaced, or there's absolutely critical data about a scholar that wasn't shared. And so when the review team sat down and went through the entire selection process, they weren't able to kind of give the candidate the results that they deserve because they were missing critical data. And so, of course, they went unfunded. And so that's kind of what led us to build this. And we kind of took a step back and said, like, well, why are these types of things happening? And we try to scope out like what are all the moving parts to running a scholarship. And that list became like very, very comprehensive and long. And we try to summarize it by basically saying like we need to have systems in place that make sure that it covers every element of scholarship management. And some of them can be extremely high level and simple, sending reminder messages or emails. Others might be a bit more complex, like having a dedicated process in place to collect references, right? And we'll kind of get into more best practices on if you're collecting references, how to do things like that. And the goal is that, having systems in place is critical because it gives you a checklist to kind of follow along step by step very systematically to ensure that none of those kind of critical components get missed along the way. So really quickly, my name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewer. Been doing this basically since day one in 2012. I personally have a background as a volunteer with local nonprofits and membership-based associations. I served as a evaluator or as a reader. And so a lot of those examples I just gave, I lived through. So I go way back to when it was done through paper. So physically having binders mailed to our doorstep. And to be fair, as an evaluator, having it all packaged up and sent to me wasn't the end of the world. However, I do know that the legwork that goes into compiling the information, making copies, and creating those binders was extremely overwhelming for scholarship providers. I also lived kind of that second life when organizations try to go online, right? So it was, hey, we're going to create these efficiencies, we're going to bring it to the modern age. And then I'm being told to go download a bunch of stuff, go to Dropbox, then I'll go put my notes into a spreadsheet, run a bunch of formulas, and send it back. And to be very fair, that process actually was a bit more painstaking than the physical paperwork in the binder. So that's what lets to build a reviewer. I would say at this point in time, we do north of 1,000 of these programs every single year. The reason why I bring that up is reviewer itself is a very built by the people for the people type of system. It's also why I love having these types of conversations because we can sit here and say, hey, here's some tools and things that we think you might want. But in reality, we don't know. Only you guys do. So what we're basically doing is taking a decade of organizations like yourselves who've been doing scholarships in many, many different ways in different industries that bring to us kind of unique trends or emerging trends or insights. And that's what influences the platform itself. It also opens the door to us hearing common things that are happening within the ecosystem and then hosting these types of webinars. So I will just leave it at that. Again, my goal here today is not to get too deep into the weeds in a reviewer, although I do want to visualize like what these systems may look like for you. So for those of you that already work with a reviewer on the call today, hopefully you can take some of these trends and apply them to your programs. For those of you that might be sitting kind of more in this world that I'm going to get into, I think there's some good takeaways that we can kind of get into. So again, I love this quote by John Doerr that says, ideas are easy, but execution is everything. And so when we kind of sit down and we think through like what goes into scholarship management, the very first thing that we start to think through is, okay, well, we have to collect scholarship applications. And then at some point we have to review them, make a selection. And that's not wrong, right? Applications come in, you cut checks, but that's point A and point Z. The meat and potatoes and what makes these programs highly successful is what happens between points B and Y. And that's kind of what I want to unpack here today. Like, what are those different elements and how do you, A, create efficiencies for yourself? That way you don't get bogged down to the daily grind of, paper and spreadsheets. And allows you guys to focus matters on your mission and on your vision. But then also, equally, if not more important, is how do we elevate the experience and the engagement for everybody else involved? As much as we want to create efficiencies internally, which is very, very important, you make up maybe a third of the program, if that, right? All of your applicants, the volunteers, the board members, these other stakeholders, the donors, they make up the bulk of the program. So sometimes it's really important for us to take a step back and say, yes, we can roll up our sleeves, we can kind of, get the work done on our end, but what does that really feel like and look like for everybody else? And so that's kind of where I want to get into next, which is like, what are the common systems that kind of go into this process? So I'll run through this very, very quickly. You guys can read this. I'll send this out later on. That way we can kind of dive deeper into the topics here today. But there's kind of three core experiences that I think go into running a scholarship. We have to collect a bunch of scholarship information. We have to do something with it. That's kind of where the meat and potatoes comes in. And then at some point, we have to go through a formal review and selection process. Now, I get it. There's a whole lot of other moving parts here, but very common, we're starting to pick and choose from this kind of tech stack or this list. So you might be using Google Forms to collect applications, which is great. It's a good experience for the submitter. But then operationally speaking, here in this center column, that means that you're kind of going to your Google Drive. You have to download all the applications. If you are collecting references, oftentimes those come in through email. So you have to obviously find them, figure out who they're for, download them, merge them with the application. And then that third piece is the review. That means you're going to put them into a folder. You're going to tell your volunteers to go there, download a bunch of stuff, figure out who they're for. You're probably going to be giving them a spreadsheet. You're going to say, hey, go log your notes and your feedback in the spreadsheet, send it back to us. And then we kind of rinse and repeat that process again. So now you're in spreadsheets. You have to merge everybody's information together. You're going to run a bunch of formulas. If at any way along that way the formula gets broken or if one of the columns is off, it's very possible that you're going to be looking at flawed data. And then again, it poses risk and it poses compliance problems. So I'm not going to get through all these tools. Obviously, that's what we're here at Reviewer to do, is to eliminate those. But these are the very common tech stacks that most organizations use to run scholarships before moving to a formal system in place. I'm not going to get too deep in like the negative impact on that, although I did for fun toss this into Chat GPT. I literally said, hey, if I ran a scholarship using these tools, like what would it look like? And this is exactly what it kicked out. You can kind of see the misspelling. So you know, I'm not lying. This is really what ChatGPT says. And as somebody who has gone through this process from multiple different perspectives, both operationally as well as part of a review committee, like this really resonated with me, right? There are so many moving parts. And so the negative impact on us as organizations, I think I want to spend a lot of time here talking about fairness and compliance and creating non-biased reviews. And that's kind of like one of the biggest impacts, right? Obviously, unfair applicants not being selected. You're going to have drop off and frustration from the review committees. If you are a donor fund or if it's a named scholarship, you're at risk potentially of not getting renewable funding or grants from your donors and all the other things that come into play with it. So what does this kind of look like on the other end? So obviously that's where a reviewer comes into play, is if you think through like all these common practices to run a scholarship in like a spider web type of format, it's all about taking these moving parts and consolidating them into one centralized hub. And that's what I call systems. So with all that said, this is where I want to spend the bulk of my time here today. I want to run through kind of like what a very well-structured common framework for a scholarship would look like, that A, lowers the barrier for your scholars, makes it very, very simple for them to get in. You know, we don't want them interacting with tools. We want tools to be interacting with them. We want to make sure that we're collecting very hyper personalized information from them. The name of the game here is basically to help your applicants build a persona about themselves, differentiate themselves from other candidates, putting them in the best position for achieving success and funding. At the same time, you know, you guys have very critical data that you have to be collecting. It could be FAFSA information, it could be tax documents, it could be essays, it could be references. So kind of nested behind the scenes there is, okay, we're asking these scholars to submit to us very, very confidential stuff. I mean, tax documents is about as PII as it gets. How do we do so in a very safe, secure manner where, again, we're not opening up our organizations or our foundations to risk or compliance issues as well? And then long term, I think it's very important for us. I think this is a separate conversation, but and not to get too political, about a month ago, there was the federal freeze on grants and funding. And one of the biggest questions that popped up was, okay, well, if we want to achieve additional follow-up funding or prove value to our funders, how do we actually measure impact, right? If we're receiving funds or if we're distributing funds to applicants and scholars, how do we go back to our donors and to our board members and say, look, you know, we started with this fund, here's who we funded, here's what they did with it, and here's like the actual measurable, tangible impact that we were able to have on these people's lives. And that's the powerful story that takes your programs to the absolute next level. And so we'll kind of get a bit more deep into like what does the trail and data collection look like from scholars, so you can have those kind of fun conversations with your team and kind of celebrate the success of all the work that you put into your programs. So with all that said, I do want to kind of visualize like what does the scholarship experience look like? I mentioned beforehand that there's kind of three parties involved. So you make up 33% of the program. How do you lower that barrier for the scholars themselves? And again, that's mission, I guess, critical item number one is creating this ecosystem where they can kind of get in and get out and get on with their lives. So again, to visualize that in Reviewer, I do want to kind of just preview like what a common application structure will look like. So in our system itself, everything starts with a concept called a profile. And to preface this again, I don't care if you use Reviewer or not. I'm not here to kind of show you the platform. You know, you guys can use whatever tools and systems you want. But the concept behind a profile is absolutely critical for you guys to be thinking through because there are so many moving parts to a scholarship. It goes way back to that third or fourth slide where I had a list of all these different tools. You've got people, and I think it's very easy for us to look at these programs from a data perspective, right? We have essays, we've got file uploads, we've got scorecards, we got funding. And while data is necessary, we're dealing with actual people and we have to treat them as such. And so the concept behind a profile is the person themselves has an account, and within their account, it holds on to absolutely everything that relates to them. So their personal information, their submission forms, I say forms plural because you may be collecting additional forms in the future, file uploads, communication, judging and scoring, potentially even feedback to those that don't receive funding, right? How do we offer them real tangible feedback on why we selected people the way that we did? That way, if they don't receive funding, there's some takeaway that they can take and apply again in future iterations or for other scholarship providers. And so the only way that this is possible and the only way that you can systematize your programs is to start this by creating these profiles. And it has to have a centralized hub to hold on to all the information about those candidates. So what does that look like? This is a really well-structured submission process. Again, the whole name of the game here is your application forms and how you collect your data is going to be directly tied to the mission and vision of your organization. There is no catch-all template that you can use. With that said, I think there's three commonalities that you can apply to your applications. Some of the organizations that we work with put an emphasis on grades, others put an emphasis on like community impact, others put an emphasis on essay writing. So for me, it's like, how do we kind of combine all of those into a narrative or a persona about the applicant? So for me, there's three things that come into play. There's academic achievements. Let's build like an academic profile around them as a scholar. Number two is potentially financial need. The world's not black and white. You got some applicants who come from different backgrounds. They might be the grandson of Warren Buffett versus somebody else who's going to take out student loans. Again, they both might have different financial needs. So how do you take that into consideration? And then the most important, and again, this is one of the main takeaways today, is how do you give your scholars a voice, right? How do you help differentiate them from a very, very kind of competitive crowd of applicants? And that can be done through kind of two different things or three different things. Essay writing, potentially even video essays, which I absolutely love, and then external references. So let's get into some of those things. One of the other examples I want to offer here, and I do know there's one person, I'm not going to call them out on this meeting today, who does this. They offer multiple scholarships. And one of the challenges that scholarship providers have that have multiple scholarship opportunities or multiple funds is basically the applicants may not even be aware of what scholarships are even available to them. So they might have a scholarship with a very hyper specific criteria and eligibility. And year over year, that scholarship almost goes unfunded because they just don't have any volume. And the reason why is that people have no idea that it exists, or B, that they're even qualified for it. So to start this off, I talked about how we don't want to be interacting with systems. We want systems to interact with us. So one of the, popular components in Reviewer that I love to see is basically create like a matching tool. And you can do this two different ways. If you don't offer multiple scholarships, treat this as an eligibility check. We do not want to waste scholars' time applying for funding that they just don't have a chance to receive. If you're a scholarship provider in North Carolina and I'm applying from Wisconsin, I should not be able to get through. Number two is you don't have the bandwidth to kind of vet and measure every applicant. And so the more that you can kind of cut down the eligibility and kind of systematize the pre-review, the better experience as well as the time saving for you guys. In this example, however, it's using a matching tool. So there's very specific scholarships available for certain people, people who are pursuing a career in a certain field like archaeology, maybe you're a high school athlete, whatever that example might be. So the way that this works is the applicant basically answers a series of questions. Now, this is a very, very basic example. I've seen some that are 100 questions long and they build like a really deep kind of persona about the applicant. And then what happens here is the system will in real time say, hey, based on what you just put into the system, here is what we're going to go ahead sorry, one second. Here's what we're going to say you're eligible for. So based on your criteria, you're eligible for the Lennox Wilder Scholarship, the Brooke Marlowe Scholarship, and the Jasper Rye Scholarship. From there, the applicants can select which of or all of them they want to apply for, and then move on to the next step, which is basically maybe a very customized application form based on the scholarship that they chose. So again, two things happen. Number one is we made sure that people were eligible to get through. And then two is that the applicant in this example, Michael, may be applying to a scholarship that he or she didn't know it even existed. So from here, we get deeper into the building out like the academic profile. So uploading of transcripts, class rank, GPA scores. Here's another kind of pro tip here. If your scholarship program is collecting academic achievements, so test scores and GPA, and you are using that value to impact the scores, do not ask your review team to score them. Do that automatically. So for example, here, if we have a 3.75 GPA, maybe that means that this applicant automatically gets 5 points or 10 points. Let the systems do that for you. Let your review team only focus on like what you need their brains for. All the automated metrics we can do for you. So as the applicant applies, it's almost creating like a built-in leaderboard and real-time kind of results before it even gets into the hands of the judges. So applicants put in some of these academic achievements, extracurricular activities, and then it moves on to the financial need. So in this example, it's asking us more for, what school are you applying for? I love this example because it gets deep into like tax documents, FAFSA calculations, helping build a better narrative around like, are you in financial need or not? It's a very kind of gray area where just because you have a family with a high income doesn't necessarily mean that they're not in financial need. So it tries to help build out like, okay, well, like how do we consider an applicant in need or not? So FAFSA, 1040 tax documents, parent income. But it also says, hey, if you don't receive scholarship funding with us, how are you going to pay for this? So do you have applicants who are going to take out, 8% student loans, or, do they have parental assistance, or are they working through college? Again, this is not going to be the selection process. It does, however, add one component to it so that way when your team sits down to go through a review, you actually are able to kind of comprehensively compare one candidate to the next. The next example that we're going to get into that I'll pause on here is collecting application content with essays, video essays, and references. So if there was one component to an application that's an absolute necessity, it's going to be this. Give your applicants a voice. Let them kind of differentiate themselves from one candidate to another. Now, I will say that there's a large percent, upwards of 80% of candidates who are going to be taking this essay prompt and they're going to copy and paste it into tools like ChatGPT. So we are here in the next couple months launching an AI detection tool. I'm not going to get too deep into that today. Just keep in mind that your applicants are doing this right now, and they're not going to stop doing it, and it's probably okay, right? Like we live in a time where like AI utilization is going to be like the norm. Um, I could almost argue that we want to reward candidates who are using it to its fullest. What we don't want to see happen though is them copy and paste this into Chat GPT, take our answer, and then copy and paste it back. So for you guys, what we're going to want to do is figure out like what utilization scores are we seeing happening, right? Is the average utilization like 30%? So anybody who's like way higher than 30, we want to revisit. Anybody way lower than that's good to go. Just helping you guys be aware of like how much utilization is happening. I am personally a huge advocate of video essays. I think it's a really, really, really good way for applicants to let their personality shine. From a marketing perspective, it's really great for you guys to do post-scholar marketing by showing the videos and the testimonials that they submitted. Just keep in mind that anytime you start to do things like that, you are going to have potentially a lower number of applicants because it adds a separate barrier for them to apply. So there's like that cost analysis and trade-off of, okay, do we want higher quality content or do we want more applicants? That's totally up to you. In this example, it's going to be optional. So you could do either a video essay or you can do a written essay. The second thing that I want to kind of look at here is the references themselves. So kind of getting deeper into the reference request process, one of the more common tools that we see happening is applicants will put in like the name and email of who the reference is. And then from there, it triggers an email to go to the references. So one of the biggest challenges with references, and I'm a huge advocate of them, I think having a separate party speak about your applicants is another way to add like a personal touch and personality to it. The challenge with reference is two things. Number one, is historically speaking, it's going to come directly from the reference, right? It's got a very private process around it. And so a lot of times your references don't even want the applicants to see it. So they're going to send it to you via email. They're going to use potentially short names. They're not going to tell us, who it's for. So you're left kind of trying to figure out, I have an inbox full of references. Who do they belong to? And how do you actually join them together? Problem number two is kind of this outdated process of reference letters, which I'll get into. So in this example, we try to combat the first problem by basically automating the pairing for you. So it says, Dear Dwight, Michael's asked you to write a reference on his behalf. Click here to do so. From there, your reference clicks on a link, and then it brings them into a dedicated reference portal. So again, this is an example of one of those system checklists that I talked about. So what's going to happen here is the applicant or the reference comes in, and yes, they absolutely can still upload a reference letter. However, I think one of the emerging trends that we've started to see is ditching reference letters because a lot of times it's a better reflection of the person writing the reference, not who it's for. We're also finding a lot of times that people who write references will just take an existing reference, swap out the name, and submit it. So it's not even like really providing any value to you guys. So the alternative model is to almost have them fill like what I call like a reference quiz or a reference template. So you could have them rank the applicants on a series of parameters, or maybe you want to offer them like two or three reference prompts. So answer these three questions. So it lowers the barrier for the reference. They just answer the questions as it appears. And then operationally speaking, when you go to review your candidates, the data is very, very consistent because every single candidate had the reference answer the same type of questions. So again, it goes back to like creating a fair, unbiased, compliant review process. There is no comparing apples to oranges. We create a very even playing field where the top candidates will automatically rise to the top. I will show you what this will look like here in just 1 second. So let's kind of jump back then to the admin portal here. and talk about systematizing operations. So I don't want to get too deep into this slide. I really want to kind of jump way ahead here to creating the fair, non-biased review process. Just keep in mind that I talked about how the goal behind creating systems is to kind of work in that middle ground. So A is opening applications, Z is cutting checks. What happens in points B to Y? That's your operations command center. So it's not just collecting applications and then sending them off to the review team. There are so many more moving parts that goes into this. Number one is just sanity for your team's sake, right? Like you can't be hopping back and forth between emails, spreadsheets, online tools, databases, spreadsheets, you name it. You have to have one spot to go for absolutely everything. It's also extremely critical in scholarship making because from an applicant perspective, you're dealing with student information or PII. So you might be collecting social security numbers, tax documents, FAFSA, all of those examples I just gave you. Any personal identifying information physically cannot live in a spreadsheet and it cannot be transmitted amongst your staff via email. It's just not a safe, secure way of doing things. You will find that over time, applicants are going to become more aware of like their data security and their privacies. If you're in California, you already know this is happening. And so how do you give them peace of mind as well that when they submit their confidential information, that it's going to go to a safe, secure place? They know exactly what's going to happen with their data. There's protocols in place to protect absolutely everybody. So again, the last kind of point here is that you have to think through like from an operation perspective, like what goes into it. You have to be able to monitor progress in real time. You have to be sending out reminder messages. You should be communicating every step of the way. So providing transparency to applicants, review teams. Humans will absolutely always procrastinate. That's not just your scholars, but also your board members and your volunteers doing the review. So how do you kind of identify potential evaluators that haven't started yet or they're lagging behind, send them automation reminders, things like that. How do you redact data, which we'll kind of get into here in a little bit. So obviously you've collected this really robust profile. Now clearly that entire profile doesn't need to be shared with the review team, right? You only want them to see what they need for review and selection. So how do you very, very quickly and easily redact any PII from their point of view? Part of the bigger conversation here is how do you take your scholars and actually pair them up with a committee for review, which we'll kind of get into here in just a second. And then ongoing data collection. So how do you collect, impact reports from your applicants saying, hey, what were the funds utilized? Can you give us a testimonial of how our scholarship changed your life? Things like that you're going to ultimately need to go back to your boards and to your teams to show impact, right? So I'll leave it at that. Your command centers have to have a way to manage all of that. So what does that look like in Reviewer? I kind of want to first and foremost start with the dashboard. And the only thing I want to kind of touch on here is the real-time visibility of what's happening. So again, you've got a one-stop shop to manage the entire scholarship process. It shows you in real time how many days until deadlines. It shows you where people are at. Are they done? Are they not done? If they are done, have they been selected? And now they're in like the post scholar deliverable phase. If they're in progress, you want to send them built-in reminder messages. But we also do that for your references as well. And that's kind of what I wanted to show you here, which is basically here's a list of all the outstanding references who have been requested. Here's done, who's not done. Here's reminders to them. You can send notifications to the applicants once the references are complete. That way it gives them peace of mind. Again, these are all small checklist items as part of the system that you can kind of just cross off as you go, knowing that it's already kind of baked into the process for you. So the one thing I want to show you here, though, is physically viewing applications. I use that term profile quite a bit. Again, whatever tools that you're using, you basically have to kind of get to this model where when you click on somebody's name, you have a visual of all their content. So if I go ahead and scroll through my menu here, I'll find a scholar. And when I click on their name, you can kind of see in real time that we take all of their information and we consolidate into one spot. So here's Michael. Here's all the content we collected from Michael. If I scroll through here, here's the file uploads, here's the scores, here's the headshots, you name it. There's also some pretty cool built-in communication tools. So if you ever wanted a one-to-one send communication directly to your applicants, you can. You can log notes about them. So if you want to collaborate internally with your staff, you can, but that communication stays private. If you want to check out those file uploads, so again, this example, I've got a 1040 document, I got a FAFSA, I've got a headshot, I might even have a video essay. The idea here is that I can just simply click on the deliverable. I never have to download, I never have to export, I never have to send this to my team. It just pops up right in front of me. So here's a resume, here's a headshot and or a video essay playing. Here's your tax documents or your FAFSA. Again, it kind of consolidates everything under their profile. The last thing I want to show you here is references. So in this example, you can see that I've got three different deliverables. I've got Tom who submitted a transcript, and I got both Steve and Paula who submitted references. The idea is that once those get submitted, it actually goes automatically to the applicant's profile, where when you click on it, it'll embed the content that was submitted. So this could be your reference templates, it could be the rankings, it could be the reference file upload if they're doing letters, whatever you decide to do. But the end goal here is I've got Michael Scott, the scholar, and within different tabs, going way old school to like a binder concept, I can see who he or she is. I can view their submission forms. I can view their file uploads. I can view their references. I can communicate with them, and then also look at the results and all the activities associated with them. So again, centralize absolutely everything. Okay, so I know moving pretty quick because this is where I want to spend a bunch of time. So my passion here is basically how do we create fair, unbiased selections? At the end of the day, no matter how much scholarship funding that you provide or how many scholars you have, you are changing people's lives. That's also why I like to talk about experiences. These are people, not data. So how do we structure these campaigns or these programs in a way that we can ensure that applicants get the time and energy that they deserve? So first and foremost, what we've learned over the years is that on average, most volunteers specifically cannot physically read more than 20 scholarship applications. After 20, their energy levels fall off pretty dramatically. So if you give them 50 to 100, like how do we ensure that they gave the same kind of energy that applicant number 62 got as number one? And the answer is they probably didn't, right? So how do you structure a review process where A, all of your applicants get reviewed, but B, that you're doing so in a way that your volunteers are highly efficient, they're not reviewing too many people, they're able to give all of their time and energy to the applicant because at the end of the day, the applicant deserves it from them. And so we have a concept called buckets, which I'll introduce here in just a minute. Obviously, before you share those applications with the review team, we absolutely should be redacting data. When I talk about data redaction, there's two elements that come into play. There's PII, so hiding name, hiding demographic details. If there's any data that you collect that potentially a reviewer could use to make an unbiased selection, we have to hide it from their point of view. There's no gray area here. If we feel that if a evaluator reads that content and it may sway their decision, we have to hide it from them. Number two is, again, being sensitive to their time. You are collecting a lot of stuff, and much of it might be for record keeping purposes only. So if that is the case, just don't show it to the review team. We want them to get in, view exactly what we need from them, get in, get out. I'm a father of two. If I was reviewing these scholarship applications, I'm doing it like on a Wednesday night at 10 o'clock at night, right? I don't have 4 hours to sit and download a bunch of stuff and handwrite notes and fill out spreadsheets. I want you to show me what I have to review. I want to fill out a scorecard and I want to submit it. That then brings us into the second piece, which I'll jump back to reviewer, is the review process itself. So I'm aware that many of these scholarships do require deliberation, right? Data and scores and metrics do not tell the whole story. So it's very important for us to kind of sit down with our committees and our team and kind of talk about the results, let them kind of make a compelling case for maybe one candidate over another. But it's critical that we start with data, right? We have to have some type of data-driven insights to power those discussions in a meaningful way. So your scorecards or your selection criteria shouldn't be overly complex. Now, yes, we do have clients that have, weighted scoring algorithms. They have really robust scorecards. But generally speaking, your review process should flow and be matched up with the data that you're collecting within your submission form, right? So if you're collecting volunteer hours, if you're collecting academic achievements, if you're collecting essays and references, directly pair that to a scorecard question. Best practice here as well is maybe don't ask your review team to allocate points. So, on a scale of 1 to 5, it's probably okay. It's a small enough margin. Some of our clients have like on a scale from 1 to 20. So when a review person sits down, it's very hard for them to differentiate a 16 versus a 17. And believe it or not, when you start to average things out, like that 1 point difference totally does make a difference. So number one is you have to create expectations for the review team. So a very structured scorecard. That way, whenever your volunteers come in to begin scoring, they all have kind of the same lens that they're looking for through. They're answering the questions in a meaningful way. They know what's being requested from them. That way you don't have like misconceptions amongst your staff. Number two is maybe move towards more of like an emotional response process. So instead of saying on a scale from 1 to 10, you say from below average to exemplary, rate this person's essay writing, right? Or grammar. And the idea is that behind the scenes, you'll still leverage point values to kind of help build these leaderboards. But generally, when you're having a review person come in, read through applications, and they elicit an emotional response, it's going to be more engaging for them. They're going to be way faster at it. And then typically speaking, it gives you a lot higher quality and accurate scores as well. So the goal here is again for your review team to come in side, see content, answer scorecard questions, and move on with their life. So I threw a lot at you there. I do want to kind of visualize that because the pairing process of taking a bunch of applicants and giving them to the review team, especially if you're trying to avoid them reviewing more than 20 to 25 people, can be quite challenging. And then also, like, how do you structure these leaderboards? Because one thing you can't be doing, especially when time is of the essence, is taking a bunch of scores, creating formulas, merging content. Like, when the results come in, you physically should never be touching it or modifying it whatsoever. Because anytime our hands touch spreadsheets or formulas, there is a chance for human error, which opens up a huge risk potential or compliance as well. So, what does that look like? So, within Reviewer, we have this concept called buckets. There's a million ways to set this up. I would say for the majority of our scholarships that we work with, they do it in conjunction of two different ways. If you offer multiple scholarships, you may have one bucket for each scholarship. Again, going way back to the beginning using systems, the systems that you use should have automation. So if I apply to the Lennox Wilder scholarship, it should automatically drop me into that bucket. You should never be having to manually move people or place them. Now, can you manipulate that and can you move them around? Yes, totally. Other common ways that we see this done is phases of review. So if you have a large scholarship program, 150, 200 submissions, it's very likely that you're not going to review them one time. So maybe having like an initial vetting phase where an internal staff of 4 or 5 people comes in, thumbs up, thumbs down, very, very high level selections. And then you advance them to phase two, which might be a full-blown scorecard. You've got a dedicated review committee. From there, maybe the top 30 go to phase three, which might be interviews. So those are kind of two examples. I've seen committee-based reviews as well. So they say, hey, you know what? I want each of my review team members to review like this certain type of candidate or this certain location or like these 25 submissions. So they create these buckets and basically create committees. So there's many ways to do that. What I want to show you, however, though, is how simple it can be. So in this example, we basically have a bucket called phase three. So again, this is making an assumption that a bunch of applicants got reviewed. They moved on to phase two, then they moved on to phase three. The next step is to basically take that bucket and fill it up with a team. So whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark log into Reviewer, they're only going to see the submissions in phase three. Or if you look up top, whenever Sally, Sue, and Steve come into Reviewer, they only see phase one. So it's a way for you to take these large numbers of applicants. And when I say large, it doesn't have to be hundreds of people. It could be just all of your applications. And then start to kind of create like these dedicated review phases where you can kind of control who's going to see what. One of the more powerful features that we actually have at Reviewer is also called randomization. So going back to fair, non-biased reviews, one of the best ways that you can do that is basically say, okay, when applications come in, I want them to be equally and randomly shared with my team. So I don't want my review team to look at more than 20 people, but also I want to make sure that my applicants are being scored an equal number of times, right? Somebody who gets scored 5 times shouldn't be compared against somebody who was scored 25 times. So what you could do is it'll show you a list of all of your candidates as well as who your review team is, and then you can automatically pair them up. So I could literally type in, give every applicant to 3 judges. We also have a judge queuing feature, which basically says, hey, let's just give every applicant to every judge. But I want them to be scored 3 times. Once they're scored 3 times, they fall off that list and nobody else can score them. So the idea here is that the system equally and randomly takes that and they automatically pair them up. So you can kind of see here that Barbara through Simon were all given 3 applicants. However, Damon got 2, and it shows you exactly who those 2 to 3 candidates were. So if you ever want to kind of run through this with a fine-tuned comb, or if you want to kind of make your own manual adjustments, you can click Edit, say for example, next to Mark's name, and it shows you exactly who Mark is currently reviewing, and then you can reassign, you can unassign, do whatever you want with it. So the general premise here is we understand that you have all these applicants and these committee members. Yes, you absolutely can assign them to everybody. Or if you want to kind of take a step back and say, I want them to review 25 people, leverage automation, leverage randomization. And then from there, if you want to have very finite manual control, you should be able to do so. So again, the next piece to this is redacting of data. But what does this look like from a committee member's perspective? So when the review teams come into the system, they basically will see a menu of who they're supposed to be reviewing. Again, this is where this interface will change depending on if you're doing data redaction or not. So things like name or emails will not show up here whatsoever. But goal number one is lowering the barrier. Again, these are potentially volunteer doing this at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday. They have to be able to come in, see exactly who they're going to review. From there, they're just simply going to click into it. And then they get a split screen. So half of the page is going to be the applicant profile, and the other half of the page is going to be what I call a scorecard. This is actually going against what I said earlier, where this scorecard off to the right has like on a scale from 0 to 30. It's totally fine. Again, one of those emerging trends though is, from good to great or from below average to above average, and then having point values sitting behind the scenes. So the goal here is that your review team can very, very quickly and very, very easily compare the application to their scorecard. They're independent, so as they scroll through here, they can answer a series of questions. They can jump up to the top. They can look at the file uploads. Again, if you have tax documents or if you got headshots or if you got resumes, it will embed itself in Reviewer. I do not want to see your review teams ever downloading stuff. Number one is potentially it could be risky. Number two is that we live in, hard to believe, 2025. If this was a video essay recorded on an iPhone, there's like 5 or 6 different file formats it could have come in as, and they're also going to be gigantic files. If your review team is doing this on their iPads or a tablet, how do we ensure they can actually access that deliverable? So the goal here is it creates tremendous consistency where no matter what type of file it was, it always gets embedded. They can jump over to the references, they can read through them, and then again, they can answer a series of questions. So, like I mentioned beforehand, from a compliance perspective, whenever there's point values associated with this, we do not want anybody manipulating this whatsoever. So, the idea here is that the system will have behind the scenes some type of like logic that's built in that will automatically assign point values based on the rubrics. And then you guys will basically get this leaderboard. And so in real time, you can sort and filter by your different buckets, by your different phases, by your different scholarships. And it shows you in real time a list of every single candidate, who reviewed them, how they individually scored, how they collectively scored, and averages. So going back to what I said earlier on, yes, you should be leveraging data to start this process. But again, I'm very aware that likely what's going to happen is you're going to take like the top 10, top 20, top 30 at the bottom, move them to phase two, phase three, phase four. And then this turns into a deliberation dashboard. So your teams can kind of sit down, you can do a Zoom call, and you can say, okay, here's the results. Let's talk about why we scored people the way that we did. The last little insight I want to give here again, I mentioned beforehand that I love the idea behind randomization, so taking applicants and then randomly assigning them to your team. However, that is very, very problematic because what's going to happen is you've got some committee members or some judges who, on average, just score higher and lower than others. So again, going back to creating a very non-biased review and being compliant, how do we start to identify that? And you can kind of see it happening here off to the right where Mark here scored Sheldon a 12, but Judge Judy gave it a 31. Those names are probably reversed, right? But the first question I would have if we're deliberating is, okay, well, like, Mark, why did you score this a 12? That was way lower than Judge Judy. Was it warranted? Or what if Mark has never given higher than a 13? So by Mark's own standards, he actually scored Sheldon very, very well. However, Sheldon is 100% being penalized because he's just a tough judge. So we actually have some pretty cool tools in place. I'll pause there to normalize the results. This is a real client of ours. All this data has been redacted. And they basically asked the question, like, why is it every single year whoever Judge Judy scores never gets selected, but everybody that Tony scores does? And the data tells a story. It basically says that on average, Judge Judy scores a full 10 points lower than Tony. So now that we know that, you can start to make decisions off of it or leverage tools like Reviewer to normalize it for you. And what's going to happen here is it basically will then say, well, we don't really care if you were scored a 24 by Judge Judy or a 34 by Tony. What you were really scored was average. You met that individual judge's average score. And then you can start to compare individual averages versus one another. So the end results look kind of goofy, but it basically would say the scholarship recipient on average scores about a 1.15 times higher than average. Whereas Elon here, the lowest rated applicant, scores on average almost 20% lower than the field, right? And so it allows you to kind of take this data, takes your leaderboards, takes your deliberation meetings, and then leverage data to make very well-informed decisions off of it. So I am running about 10 minutes longer than I wanted to. I want to make sure we have ample time for question and answer. So I'm going to go back here. I will mute myself and I'll let you guys kind of just ask whatever questions you might have for me. Again, they can be about the platform, but I think better yet, whatever questions that you have around like best practices, maybe challenges that you're currently facing with your scholarship process that either I can help answer or if anybody else wants to chime in, we can. As I'm waiting for these questions to come in, I'm going to kind of present behind the scenes one last concept here, which is ongoing data collection. So in this example, great, we collected applications, we lowered the barrier. It was very, very simple for scholars. You as an operator have all these tools in place to be hyper efficient. We've redacted the data, we've given it to the review team, we've used scorecards, it's a very well-oiled machine. Now we have our selections. What happens next? So generally speaking, you're going to log on their account, like how much funds that are going to be dispersed to. If it's a renewable scholarship, it's really important to talk about what that would look like. So obviously, they may be coming back once a semester or once a year and updating their profile. But from as far as measuring impact goes, so you guys have a mission and a vision, and that may change slightly depending on if you're donor-sponsored scholarships. Each one of your donors may have certain metrics that they want to have. So the idea here is that basically you create a new submission form called impact reporting, and then you have all of your scholarships applicants come back at some type of point in time, right? It could be 1 year from now, it could be 2 years from now, whatever your variable is. And you basically have your applicants or your scholars answer that form. And they're basically going to say, here's how the funds were used. Here's the impact that I had on my life. Again, that form will dramatically differ from one organization to the next. But the idea is that now you can start to generate reports. You could say, we, had this many applicants. We gave out this many scholarships. Here's how we impacted this diversity group versus this one. Here's the impact that we had. And that is basically like your little like war chest that you can use to go achieve additional funding from other donors. You can go back to your board and kind of celebrate the great success that you've had. But the only way that you can do that is if you actually collect the data. And it's very, very hard to go back to scholars and have them follow up with you, right? So having it again systematized is absolutely critical. You also absolutely cannot use any systems or tools to run your scholarships and then request applicants to submit this information to you via email or Dropbox or other forms, because now you're going back to step number one, which is your disconnected data and processes, because then you're going to be downloading and exporting and trying to recompile it. When you go to run reports, it's going to be very, very challenging because things aren't living together. So I'll kind of just leave it at that. Question came in about normalization being an absolutely a big issue on the platform. How do we pull the report to have that information and see how good or bad our reviewers are doing? Great question. And that's actually kind of going back to this example. It's a built-in report and reviewer. And we can kind of chat more personalized about your kind of process and how it's happening currently. But our system will literally kick out a report that shows you every single candidate. It shows you on a per judge basis how they scored each candidate, not just collectively, but also on a per question basis. From there, it'll identify each individual judge's trends. Again, how are they scoring on average compared to one another? So to answer your question, like how do you pull the report to see if your judges are good or bad? I'm going to read that slightly differently. I don't think there is a good or bad. I think you just have different tendencies. And so that kind of green column here at the bottom shows you those trends. So you could average this and say our average judge on average scores an average candidate of a 27. From there, you can see, okay, well, both Judge this column AL as well as Tony are higher than the average. And then you've got people like Judge Judy and Paul who are way lower than average. So for you, a couple things would come into play. Do we need to maybe coach them up or do webinars before our scholarships and kind of walk them through like common applications, how you expect them to score? That way you bridge the gap from your highest and lowest rated. Or do you not care at all and say, we brought this judge in because we generally want their expertise and their opinions and just normalize it. And then again, that's kind of what you see here off to the right. This is very, very data centric. We can talk more about this. But the idea here, and we have a lot of clients that will actually use this as their end all be all decision making. And they just basically say, I want to know how each candidate was scored and then compare it versus the averages and go from there. So it's really up to you what you want to do with it. With that said, you have to have the data readily available with one click to be able to make those decisions. And while I'm waiting too for more questions, I talked about the reference collection earlier on. I think references are a very common practice with scholarships. The more that I think that we can kind of push towards that model where we ask references to submit directly into the system, but more so maybe avoid letters and more so templates, you're going to have a lot higher quality data. You're going to have references submitting much, much quicker. Again, I think that it's going to lower the barrier for them. You can also take that model and apply it to transcripts as well. That largely depends on how open the transcript offices are to using tools. You're going to have some that are very much going to want to do formal letterhead and send it to you directly. I think that's a trend that you're going to get away from here somewhat soon, right? People are more adept to using technology. But if you have, these teams or make it optional, right? Like, do you want to submit your transcript using the portal or do you want to send it to us? Ask them. It also gives you really good reporting because you can say, okay, out of all my applicants, like here's who I should be waiting on transcripts to come from versus who's submitted within the system. So, question on ongoing data. All of your recipients have to submit final reports, and you have issues with your application system you're currently using. Yeah. So, I'm going to grab one other really quick example. I'm okay with you guys seeing me do this. But here's kind of what a ongoing both grant reporting template may look like, as well as what a ongoing scholarship form would look like. You can use the terms interchangeable. So again, applicants typically come in, they create their profiles. We're going to jump way, way far ahead. So let's hypothetically look at, let me just toss in some stuff here. Let's look at this applicant here. So this interface from an applicant's perspective is very similar. So let's hypothetically pretend that Michael Scott is an applicant and he or she was selected for a grant or for a scholarship. When they come back into their profile, their interface may change ever so slightly because again, you don't want non-selected individuals to be able to submit this content to you, but they will go to a section called supplemental forms and click add new. When they do that, you're going to have a predefined list of what you want them to add. So in this example, they're going to choose from a dropdown called Grant Reporting Template. They simply select it, and then it'll drop them directly into it. So they can start to answer these questions. Now, again, this isn't a scholarship, this is a grant. This data aligns directly with the application form. So it says more about like what were your project dates and deadlines, how much did you receive? This is pulled somewhat from the form. So for example, like what were your goals? And then the actual outcome, explain the discrepancies between them. How are you measuring impact, both qualitative and quantitative? Tell us more about the utilization of your funding. Tell us more about, lessons learned, how sustainable was it? If you need follow-up funding, like how much? And then really what they basically do is they fill it out in review or they can save, they can log out, they can work at their own pace. You can see progress, you can remind them. And then once they submit this, it actually gets appended directly back to the applicant's profile. So you can see here, I go back to Michael. Here's the template that he or she just filled out. When I press view, it embeds all of his or her answers on their account. So now Michael's account holds on to he or she holds on to their initial application form, file uploads, as well as any ongoing data collection. You could do surveys, you could do fund disbursement forms, you could do thank you letters, whatever you can dream up. The idea is that any data you need to collect from your applicants, you do so in one spot and it centralizes it with the rest of their content. One of our current clients asked about the normalization report. Where do they access it? We will reach out to you. It's just a quick little toggle to turn it on. And then once it's on, you can start to generate as much as you want. Okay. Well, with that said, it looks like it's getting kind of quiet. We will go ahead and wrap it up. As always, if there's anything that we can ever do for you, again, not necessarily review or platform related, although if you want to kind of revisit that discussion, how the tools could work for you, happy to have it. If you're looking at more like a program audit to kind of take a look at like how you currently structure programs or campaigns and just, get our team's decade plus of experience, we're also happy to do that as well. So, whatever we can do to help you guys out, please don't hesitate. Really appreciate your time and your participation today and have a good one.